these Razakars, of course, one thing I need to make clear, Razakars means not Muslims. There were Hindus as well in the
Oh,
Razakars.
who were
Yes,
Razakars?
of course, because the entire administration in the Hyderabad state at that point, it was not just in the hands of Muslims, right?
Yes.
There were upper caste Hindus, particularly the landlords of Telangana. They were all basically Reddis or Velamas, two upper castes in Telangana. So if you could come up with a list of Razakars, you find these Reddis and Velamas. And then they actually needed the support from the Razakars. And then some Hindu landlords also trained
Because
Hindu.
they were afraid that the independent India would have land reforms. So the same argument as the landlords of Pakistan, right?
Right. Right.
They went with Jinnah because they realized that they would lose their Jagis if there were land reforms.
Yeah. So the portrayals, like the movie in Razakar, they just deny that reality.
Welcome to Khanversations. मैं आपका host, आपका दोस्त Muqtedar Khan, and as you can see today, we have with us a very distinguished poet and also in many ways a historian and also an anthropologist and a literary critic. We have Dr. Afsar Muhammad, who teaches at the University of Pennsylvania. Are you the only Telugu professor in the country, or there are others who teach Telugu also in the US?
Thanks a lot. Good morning, everyone. Actually, there are a few part-time positions. They're not like full-time faculty anywhere. So I think University of Pennsylvania is the one and only place that offers full-time Telugu studies.
So, Dr. Afsar Muhammad has written this book called Remaking History, and you can see how from all the posters how closely I've been reading this book. It is about a very important moment in the history of at least Hyderabad and Telangana and also India. Essentially, an event that happened this week in 1948 from 13th of September till the 17th of September, if I'm not mistaken. It's called as police action, where the Indian military basically annexed the state of Hyderabad. This was a major event clearly in the history of that state. And so your book is one of the few books, really. I mean, the only other book that I know of is by the late Mr. Noorani, who just passed away, called The Destruction of Hyderabad. And there aren't many other books out there. And given the current atmosphere in India, the issue has also been recently politicized by the movie Razakars, and we will talk about hopefully about those things. But I found your book very interesting because when I got the book, I was under the impression that it would be about police action, but it is about much more than that. It is about how Muslims have struggled to cope with the event. It is also about the relationships between Telugu-speaking people of the state and Urdu-speaking. So it's about many interesting things about essentially how Muslims have transformed their identity. And we will talk to all of it. And so we are very fortunate to have you with us, Dr. Muhammad. And I want to thank you very much because this also affects my family history. My grandparents are from Nizamabad. And it was the police action that drove them to Hyderabad. And it is amazing as to how there was total silence about it. And after I got your book, I called my oldest cousin, and he told me, very reluctantly as to how my grandfather was assaulted on the train. He was beaten up, his pagdi was torn, and all of that. And they left their homes and everything and moved to Hyderabad. So in many ways, it affected a lot of us, so we will talk about it. So first, tell us what inspired you to write this book.
Thank you so much. Actually, that's a good beginning, Muqtedar Bhai. But at the outset, I just want to share that I took so much from, of course, A.G. Nurani Sahab, along with him, Umar Khalidi Sahab, who did wonderful work. And also, I believe it's like one of the earliest works that dealt with this police action. And then he was the one who used this term genocide for all the massacre that happened between September 13th and 17th. But my immediate source of inspiration, Muqtedar Bhai, was previously I published a book about Moharram practices in the Telugu speaking, I would say Telugu Urdu speaking states of Andhra and Telangana. And then when I was documenting Mercia, both in Urdu and Telugu, around 2006 in Karimnagar, one of the big cities in Telangana. So I ran into one 75-year-old Abdul Quddus Saheb, who was a Marsiya singer. At the same time, he was also known as Moharram singer. Moharram is, in Telugu, they have a very distinctive term. So, Pirla Pandaga. So we all know Pir means saint, Muslim saint, and so the meaning is the festival of Pirs.
Uh-huh.
So that is actually the title of my book as well, published by Oxford University Press in 2013. So for that book, I actually documented his stories. During the conversation, he started talking about 1948 police action. At that point, I actually didn't realize this kind of violent incident. And then there was, but he keep on sharing the stories, anecdotes, and then memoirs of this police action. And then he started talking about how he lost his family, his friends, and then the entire property, everything that he had. So he was he remained a singular person throughout his life. Unfortunately, he passed away before COVID. And then I actually forgot about this entire conversation, Muqtedar Bhai, to be honest. But I got a call from this town from one of his students. He told me, Afsar Bhai, we lost this Buzurg person, the big person. He was actually, even during his last minutes, he was asking about the book on police action.
Oh,
So I felt so bad, and it's really like that guilt. Like, okay, how come I forget this? And then, of course, it's not easy for me
yeah.
to go back to all those I have these things on my iPhone audio recorder. So I had really hard time going back to those conversations, audio conversations. And then, as a scholar, we need to, if you are doing something from a local language, we need to create a transcript in that language. And then you got to translate it, right?
Wow.
So
So,
it's a huge process. So, of course, I was not scared of that laborious task. But more than that, every time I listened to these conversations, I was in tears. So
oh,
a lot of bloodshed, violence, people talking about losing families and properties and everything. So, so this is in the memory of that 75-year-old Marcia and then Pirla Pandaga, a storyteller, that I started writing this book.
So, what is fascinating about it is that in many ways you are writing the history of memories rather than the history of the event itself, because there is so much little contemporaneous documentation of the event, isn't it? And of course, there is the Sundarlal report, but there is not really much beyond that out there. So, one thing that I wanted to understand is that why did people choose amnesia on this issue? And is that one of the reasons why there is so much harmony, so to speak, in that region, that people choose to forget this event?
Thank you. Thank you for that, because that's another big reason why I took up this project. So there are politics here, Muqtedar bhai, politics of memory, politics of remembering and forgetting. Why people forget some key moments in history? Why do they forget it? Why do they remember only certain key moments? So one thing that happened in the case of Hyderabad state, even Telangana, is that everything connected to Muslims is totally forgotten. So because of this anti-Nizam perspective that was produced and circulated as a result of the Telangana armed struggle, and also Nehruvian policy. So they just want to, the Congress policies basically, like, so they just erase this from their mind, even though there are like so many like injuries inside. People like just they talk about this in very private conversations, and then they don't want to make it public. Even when I was documenting these witness narratives, actually I interviewed 150 witnesses from the police action, and then it was not a simple task. It was really hard because none of them they want to talk about it, because they just want to forget it. That's a big reason. And then second reason is like they were still feeling the trauma of that violence.
Were they all victims, or were there also people who did some of the horrible things that they don't want to?
I just met the victims.
Yeah.
I somehow I don't think I met any like people
Person.
who were part of that
The
who
vi-
actually participated in that violence. But I just all 150, they are witnesses, they are victims, but they are both Hindus, Muslims, Christians, and then out of 150, there are like half of them were like women, and then some of them like Dalits, untouchables. So it's like a very like it's not. This is one like thing that I wanted to emphasize. This is not something connected to Muslims. This is about every religion and every caste in this region. So almost every person living at that point, late 40s, they experienced this violence, either directly or indirectly. But of course, by the time I actually started talking to them, we lost many people.
Hmm.
Even like out of these 150 people, we don't have. I think maybe two or three people are still alive. We lost many people during the COVID, and then we lost many people because of like old age. So this way, this is the last document of those witnesses of the violence.
And it can't be reproduced. I mean, so in that sense, what you have done is quite remarkable, in just in time, in just in.
Yes,
I mean, I really
yes.
want to thank you for doing this, and also the Qudus Saab's disciple who made you feel guilty about it. I,
Mm.
so I'm not a historian, and even though I'm from Hyderabad, I was struck by some. So when the movie Razakar came, I realized that India is is going through a really very difficult time, and this whole idea of rewriting Indian history using cinema,
Right.
whether it is the Kerala story or Kashmir's story, Files, or whatever the movies. And a lot of it is lies and fabrication. So, for example, somebody was pressuring me to do a conversation on the Kerala story. And I said, of course, I will do a show saying how incompetent the Indian government is, that it allowed 33,000 people from Kerala to go and join Al Qaeda. That is what the movie says. When
Right.
actually it's only three, the cases. The reality is three, and they are saying 33,000. And so then people then stopped demanding that I do a show on the Kerala story, because
Right.
unfortunately, I think that could be how Indians are going to learn history going forward, but is from Hollywood or Bollywood movies. But with regards to the police action, there is, at least among ordinary people today, a sense of perception that a lot of atrocities were done by the Razakars. Even the Wikipedia page says there were like 2 lakh Razakars. And I was wondering, so why didn't they fight harder to keep the state? Why did they just collapse within 3-4 days, so can you tell us a little bit more about who the Razakars were? What was their, they did commit atrocities. Apparently, they also killed Mallikarjun, uh,
Yeah.
the current president of Congress. His family was also attacked by the Razakars. Can you tell us a little bit more about Razakars? What is the reality that you were able to gather about them?
Yeah, that's actually a good question, Muqtedar Bhai. Razakars, initially the literal meaning of Razakar is the volunteer.
Mhm.
So when Bahadur Arjun initiated this as a part of Ittihadul Muslimin,
Yeah.
at that moment, Razakars were just like the members who wanted to volunteer and then do some work for Ittihadul Muslimin. So Bahadur Arjun was basically encouraging young Muslims more towards education and articulating their identity. But later, that took a different turn when Bahadur Arjun died, and then Qasim Rizvi took the control.
Who was not a Hyderabad?
Qasim Rizvi, yeah, but Qasim Rizvi is a different goal. So he militarized the very idea of Razakar. So he, being a strong proponent of Islamic or Muslim state, he deliberately militarized the activities, and then he actually wanted to put a pressure on the Nizam himself, to encourage this idea of Muslim state along the lines of Pakistan.
Azad Hyderabad. That was the idea, right?
Azad Hyderabad was the term they
Mhm.
were using. And Nizam, of course, by the time was a weak ruler. He also needed the support from something like army. And then Qasim Razvi was successful in we were giving all these numbers, creating this army of Razakars to serve whatever Nizam was trying to protect from the Union government of India. So, and then these Razakars, of course, one thing I need to make clear, Razakars means not Muslims. There were Hindus as well in the
Oh, who
Razakars.
were
Yes, of
Razakars?
course, because the entire administration in the Hyderabad state at that point, it was not just in the hands of Muslims, right?
Yes.
There were upper caste Hindus, particularly the landlords of Telangana. They were all basically Reddis or Velamas, two
Mhm.
upper castes in Telangana. So if you if you could come up with a list of Razakars, you find these Reddis and Velamas. And then they actually needed the support from the Razakars. And then some Hindu landlords also like trained
because
Hindu.
they were afraid that the independent India would have land reforms. So the same argument as the landlords of Pakistan, right?
Right. Right.
They went with Jinnah because they realized that they would lose their jagis
Right.
if there were land reforms.
Yeah. So the portrayals, like the movie in Razakar, they just like deny that reality. So for them, Razakar is nothing but Muslim.
Hmm.
In one of the interviews that I documented, I think the chapter itself is called "All
And
Muslims Are Not Razakars."
yeah.
So that was given by one women witness, that statement.
Yeah.
And then I also found a lot of evidence in not only these witness narratives, but also like literary narratives, autobiographical writings, memoirs. So it's not, so the portraying Razakar as a Muslim is a very recent phenomenon. It's post-Hindutva or even before that. Yeah, maybe it has like earliest phase even during the Telangana armed struggle. So they wanted to demonize Muslims and then Nizam, and then Razakar kind of became in handy. So they just used it to demonize Muslims and Nizam. That's what's my argument. But of course, there are a lot of violence that these people committed.
There are two narratives of victimhood which are there. One is that the atrocities that the Razakars committed on primarily Hindus. And then there is the narrative of Muslims themselves being killed. I think the Sundarlal report places it like 40,000 Muslims were killed and massacred and raped and properties. My mother was, I think, about a few months old, and my mother's father, grandfather, left Hyderabad in a train with lights off, in a goods train. They ran away to Hyderabad, and they lost their home, their properties, and everything on my mother's side. There was tremendous suffering. So there are those narratives also, right? That Muslims were suffering not only at the hands of the Indian army, but also at the hands of Hindu volunteers who were then with the support of. So can you shed some light on like what was the, like what do these witnesses remember about the violence, and do they talk?
The very first thing that I noticed from my documentation is that so there was a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment about Hyderabad state and Telangana. And of course, this was not uncommon even in other like regions in Telugu Urdu speaking states. So in many ways,
I mean, this is post-partition, right? Immediately after the
also a result of the partition. And then there is this idea of Pakistan that was actually defining the identity and the sense of belonging during this particular period. But my focus in the book, Muqtedar Bhai, because it's not about, of course, when you think about Muslims, it's a very common misconception that all Muslims are also Nawabs. Right?
Yeah, I know.
It's not true.
Yeah.
Right? It's a very few people were working with Nizam and then the administration. And then more than 50% is non-Muslims. If you look into the names of the higher ups in the Nizam government,
even the prime minister was not like a very famous Urdu poet also.
Right. So I thought, okay, I need to deconstruct this history, commonly perceived prejudiced history. And then I focused on the category of ordinary Muslim, who is Garib, the poor Muslim. So who is this poor Muslim? How his or her life is different from whatever is like Nawabi, Hyderabadi Muslim. So the big argument in the book is like we need to read and comprehend this entire history from the lens of an ordinary Muslim, not from the lens of Nawabi Muslim.
Yeah.
So when you are using that lens, you are actually getting into the life stories of ordinary Muslims who were the real victims between like 1947 and then until 50. I was in Chicago last week, and then there were like survivors of this police action. And then they were talking about how they were like scared of this situation, and then how they were eager to escape from Hyderabad state, Deccan, and then some of them actually migrated to the USA, and they survived. So, but there are people, because of a lot of practical reasons, who couldn't migrate to any other place, including Pakistan, right? So I was focusing more on about their fate, like of the ordinary people, like who are like working in industries, like at that point, Hyderabad was also famous for these cigarette factories and other like medium-sized factories, right? So a lot of Muslims working in those kind of like Charminar cigarette factory and all these things.
Mm-hmm.
So my goal in the book is to bring these stories to the table, ordinary Muslim stories, rather than Nawabi stories. So that is one counter argument to this idea of Razakar. But if you look into this, like this demonization of Muslims, it's not just Razakar category. There are so many other categories that were being used to demonize Muslims and then produce anti-Muslim sentiment. And then even the newspapers published it between 1948, immediately after this violence. And then I kind of did a lot of archival research at the British Library and also here libraries in the USA. I found some of the newspapers. So they described this violence as a happy war. So it's like, what are you talking about? Is there anything like happy war? So it's like, what kind of paradoxical terminology? This is a governmental terminology that these media reports were circulating. So similar to that, even in ordinary like everyday life also, we have similar vocabulary. It's a governmental vocabulary. It's a nationalist vocabulary. It's the vocabulary that came from the politics of the nation state.
Because of the annexation, basically,
Right.
because
Yeah.
outcome was happy. So
Right.
in that sense,
Yeah.
so one of the things about the period is that there are layers and layers of conflicts. Right, there's just the independence has happened,
Yeah.
and so there's a struggle for independence going on, even though the events of the invasion and
Right.
annexation of Hyderabad happened in 1948. The preparation was happening already. Then you had the Telangana rebellion going on, isn't it? And then on top of that, the partition and the violence in the north as a result of it. So, were you able to kind of gather as to what was having the more impact? Was it more of local politics, or was it also national politics aggravating the politics and the memories? What was left with these? Because you're, after all, interviewing them nearly 70 years later, right?
Right.
So there are memories of what really happened then. Oh, well, you were doing this in 2006, so about 50, 60 years later. But like, was it about the idea of the nation, or was it about getting independence from a Muslim state? Like, what was the main driving force of that?
Yeah. So there are politics of nationalism, as I explained before. So one thing is that particularly Nehruvian government, of course, in all this like violence, is the then Home Minister Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, who was a big factor agent in this activity. So Nehru, because he felt the responsibility of protecting Hyderabad, because Hyderabad was at the center of the country,
Mhm.
right? He don't want to. Neither he or Patel, they don't want to lose that heart of the country. So and then the second fear, particularly Nehru was scared of like the rise of Communist Party.
Mhm.
So, in 1952 election, there was everywhere there was a talk that the communists are going to win the election in Telugu Urdu speaking states. And then Nehru, in the name of controlling the Razakars and then Telangana rebellion, he was responsible for the killing of thousands of communists, both Hindu and Muslim. So these killings, Muqtedar Bhai, is not confined to Muslims. There were also Hindus
Were
who
killed.
were part of,
Yeah, that
who were
continued
part
till, till 1952, I think, or even beyond that,
so
right?
between 1948, during that particular 1 week, and
Yeah.
after that.
Okay.
So that happened through the years between 1948 and then until 52.
I had not
So
realized
52 was general election.
even
Then
the
by the time
US
you want to kill, you want to wipe out this communist party.
the US had a role to play. I had not thought about this at all. But in the entire affair, even the US embassy was involved. US records of
Yeah.
the right. Could you just shed some light on that?
Oh, I don't think so,
I mean, there was
because
some understanding between Nehru and the US embassy that communists would not be allowed to thrive in India
oh,
because of the Cold War context, right? 1950.
oh, right. But in my work, I couldn't find any evidence for that. Because Nehru himself, and then on the other hand, you have Patel. You don't need any external force to do that. So they're equally capable of doing this. And then all the military that came invaded Hyderabad at that point. It's basically all the every kind of military force was used, right?
Mhm.
So you find, if you look into the pictures from this particular violence, you see on the streets, you see all kinds of military,
Thanks.
dominantly visible.
Yeah.
You don't see ordinary people walking on the streets or anything. So there was actually ordinary people couldn't even walk on the streets. So this was all military on the streets, and then in the neighboring towns and then villages, right? But relatively, I was told that Hyderabad was a little peaceful because of its urban nature. Most neighborhoods, they have this urbanity, right? So people don't know who is their neighbor,
Mhm.
and it was easier at that point to hide in a city. So
Yes,
most communities,
people take care of
most communities, they actually migrated from the villages and towns of Telangana to Hyderabad city, and then started settling in Hyderabad. So that kind of very interesting factor. Actually, maybe in future, I want someone to take up that project of how migrations worked at that point, and
A lot
then
of
what are the
Muslims migrated to Hyderabad from Nizamabad and other.
everywhere.
Yeah.
Karimnagar, Khammam, Nalgonda, almost you can find migrations from every place in Telangana, and
To
also some parts of coastal Andhra.
even though there are still the population, they're significant, like about 5 to 6%, even in Andhra Pradesh. One aspect of your book that I found interesting was how you looked at how Muslims coped with the police action, and you talk about the concept and identity of Naya Musalman, the new Muslim, uh, and also the departure from the Nawabi culture and the rejection. But you look at it through Telugu writers and
Right.
poets, and some of them were actually Hindus, like
Right.
Swami, who was writing stories. Could you tell us a little bit about the author and the stories he wrote about Muslims? It is very interesting from your claim that you're trying to understand Muslim identity through fiction written by a non-Muslim author.
Yeah. That's a big source for me in this work because at that point, of course, when it comes to Telugu, it was mostly like Telugu speaking. Even though most of these writers they studied and they grew up in Urdu education, they were passionate about their Telugu. So they started writing about Muslims in Telugu, both
Mhm.
autobiographical writings and also creative writings. Even if you, in the case of like, if you look at the newspaper articles published during this period, so you also find a lot of writings were done by non-Muslims. So the big reason, of course, there were also a big number of Urdu writers at that point, like as I discussed in the book, Magdu Mahyuddin, Jilani Bano were there. But my focus actually was like because I want to see this like cross-cultural kind of aspect, like how non-Muslims understood this police action and the Muslim sense of belonging. So most of these writers, they actually defined themselves as
Mm.
Muslims as a category. So they don't care about their Hindu identity. So they actually were trying to what you can call like Islamicate
So they were
in
Hindus, but who wrote as if they were Muslims.
right. So because they were grateful to their like learning process because they grew up studying Urdu and
Yeah.
they whatever they learned about Telugu literature that that I, that actually came from Urdu, particularly progressive writers movement.
Mhm.
So of course, writers like Magdu Mahyuddin and Jilani Bano, who were like insiders of the progressive writers movement for a big reason. And then of course they were like indirect followers of progressive writers movement.
So this is
So
basically Telugu progressive movement, you're saying?
both.
Both.
We have both Telugu and Urdu. So that's a blend of two languages. There is no way that you can separate that public sphere into like Telugu public sphere and then Urdu public sphere. It's a hybrid public sphere. So you have both Telugu figures and Urdu figures, Hindus and Muslims and Christians, right?
Exactly.
There is no separation in terms of the making of the public sphere.
You do talk about a shared culture, shared tehzeeb, the word you have used.
Right.
I
Mhm.
mean, people in the north talk a lot about the Ganga Jamna tehzeeb, and in the
Mhm.
south, and
Right.
especially in the context of Hindu
Yeah.
celebrations of Muharram, you talk
Right.
about it, right?
Right.
And often when people talk about whether they're talking about the Ganga Jamna Tehzeeb or they're talking
Mhm.
about shared Hindu Muslim cultures,
Mhm.
they often talk about Hindus practicing either some form of Sufism
Right.
or
Right.
other Muslim. Like
Right.
the description that you gave of Muharram as
Mhm.
festival of saints, it clearly tells me that it is the Sufization of Muharram more
Yes.
than that, right? So, but not many people talk about what Hindu practices did Muslims uh, imbibe as part of the shared culture,
Right,
right?
right,
So,
right.
so could you tell if you know or identified what were the Hindu things that Muslims were doing
Yes,
in that
exactly,
period?
exactly. Like the immediate thing that comes to my mind as I studied in my previous book. So the image worship.
Ah, ah,
So image worship is a shirk, right? Forbidden in
Islam.
Islam, right? But in like that is one major like practice from Hinduism. Like so, of course, Tajia, Alam, like this procession of battle standards is very common in Hyderabad and also
Yeah.
outside of Hyderabad, right?
You're coming from like Ganesh
Right,
and
right,
Ram Navami celebrations. Yeah.
right. Yeah, but quite interestingly, uh, even like the big five of the family of the Prophet, uh, Ali, Fatima Zahra, Hussein, and Hassan, and then in some cases like Zainab and Qasim,
Mhm.
the Battle of Karbala, you know, they are worshipped as just Hindu gods and goddesses. See, the idea of God and goddesses, that's Hindu idea, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, particularly like Ali and then Fatima worship. They also have actually exclusive processions for Fatima al-Zahra in many places in Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. So this is like one of the things that Muslims adopted from Hinduism. The second aspect is like the connections made between Hindu um, classical texts, including the Ramayana, Mahabharata, and Bhagavad, with the stories of Muharram and Sufi stories. So, in some of the stories that I documented in the previous book, there is a long narrative which goes like Fatima is Sita, Sita is Fatima, they suffered the same, they lost the kids, they lost the family. So they narrate this story, comparing Fatima from the Battle of Karbala. Of course, she wasn't there at that moment, but in the imagination, public imagination, Muqtedar Bhai, Fatima was alive during the Battle of Karbala, and then Hassan was also alive.
Hmm.
That's like not like the typical chronology of Battle of Karbala, right?
Yeah.
So we compare the life story of Fatima with the life story of Sita from the Ramayana.
Okay.
So the comparison is not about like it's not about Hinduism or Islam. It is like the
Shared
way
suffering. Suffering. It's about suffering.
yeah, it's basically like that pain and suffering. How do you feel when you lose your son or daughter? Kind of suffering. And then there's idea of martyr saint, Shahid.
Yeah.
So of course, martyr saint narratives are very common in this region.
In all
Yeah,
religions in
also
India.
a very big reason.
Even
And you
sickness.
know, most of these Salami songs in Muharram context, they are basically Islamic. And Islamic means Muharram related.
Yeah.
But they are also very popular in Hinduism, right? So there is a lot of like exchange between Hinduism and Islam, but there is no way that we can separate what aspects of Hinduism Muslims take, and then what aspects of Islam Hindus take, right? So there is this is like a very that this texture of ordinary life, and then storytelling, and then the practicing rituals. It is so well knitted. So there is interwoven, right, with multiple kind of cultural aspects. That is what one of the things that I took from my conversations with the Abdul Qudus Sahib, whom name I mentioned in the beginning of this interview. So Abdul Qudus Sahib, in one of the conversations, he said, because of the police action, we lost that ihsan, the beauty of Tehzeeb culture. So he particularly emphasized these two terms, Tehzeeb and ihsan. Ihsan of sharing life, sharing devotion, sharing classical and then these religious stories. So that beauty, it is gone forever. That is what, that's his, the major thing that I took from Abdul Qudus Sahib.
Basically, the police action ended up creating a partition between Muslims and Hindus in the region.
Right.
That's what he's trying to say.
Right. Mm-hmm.
One theme that I found intriguing in yours is this concept of the new Muslim.
Yes.
So I want to know, how did Muslims change in thinking about themselves? What's the difference between the new Muslim perception of himself or herself and the old Muslims? What are the differences?
So one thing that happened after the police action, because the community, the entire community, it's not just about Muslims, it also includes Hindus. Entire community was undergoing this huge trauma. Particularly for Muslims, it was such a terrible situation. They lost their jobs, they lost their properties, and then, as I explained before, they don't have enough resources to migrate to other countries, other places. So they are stuck there forever. So what they were trying to do at this point, particularly 18 plus generation of young Muslims, they were actually trying to grapple with this situation, violence, and then trauma. One thing they found useful was to meet in small groups, like study groups. Oh yeah, let us meet this evening at some place and then share our stories. So there was something like talk therapy. So this was actually started by, quite interestingly, one elementary school teacher in the old city of Hyderabad, about whom I mentioned and discussed, whose activities actually led to the formation of an organization. So the reorganization, reconstruction of the community. That is that reconstruction as a process that actually started with talking about violence. Everybody was quiet because they couldn't talk about it. It's buried in their heart. And then they couldn't deal with that. And then this Tamire Millat, the very first thing they did was okay, rather than burying it in your interior heart, just open up. Talk about it. And then talking helped them to engage with Urdu language again. So they and then at a secondary level, they started engaging with progressive writings. And then reading culture became a major aspect. So if you look the cover page of the book, so these people this was 1948. Yeah. They were sitting outside one chai shop and then reading the newspapers. The siyasat came after the police action, right, 1949. So siyasat, I believe, such a wonderful contribution in the making and the reconstruction of the Muslim community of Hyderabad. So they did so many things. One is because at that point, even speaking in Urdu was also people were even scared of speaking in Urdu. Because, because if you speak in Urdu, immediately they go, this is a Muslim, and then they might kill you. So siyasat fought with that kind of situation, fought with that fear. taught the people to encounter that fear. So language became a big source of identity formation, right? And then Siyasat also started publishing rather than conservative writing. They focused more on progressive Muslim writing. So when I am using this term Naya Musalman, it is like in many ways, it's about that new generation of Muslims, 18 plus men and women from Muslim community, and also, of course, Hindus were part of this activity. So Naya Musalman is a category that actually speaks about different activities, starting with this opening up and then speaking out loud about the violence, the identity, and the second, dealing with the language politics. And then finally, it's also about Hindu-Muslim exchange, the tehzeeb, that the Hyderabadi tehzeeb. And they want to keep up, and then like they want to protect that tehzeeb. So that was a big activity between after the police action. And then for 3 years, young Muslims and then Hindus from the city, they were really busy with so many activities of reconstruction. And then women education became like a major factor. A lot of Muslim women, they started reading these new writings and then engaging with public issues. In Jilani Bano's novel, Urdu novel, of course, it's also in many ways, I would say, a very significant contribution to Telugu literature as well. So the Muslim women in Zanana, the interior courtyard, they read the newspapers and then discuss the issues, political issues. So talking about politics was a big part of this category of New Muslim. So actually this category, Muqtedar Bhai, that's not my scholarly category. I took it from my witness narratives, including Sahib.
So basically what you're saying is that maybe before the police action during the Nizam state, the kind of Muslim which was dominant was right of center, and
right.
It's more about poetry and Islamic literature, right?
Right.
Whereas the new Muslim who came afterwards was more progressive, more politicized, left-leaning, definitely, right?
It's not like that is not how we can't make that simple generalization. But not many.
Most progressive were
but there is also open kind of
discussion. And so they were willing to reach out. So the animosity towards Hindus did not exist in the new Musalman. You're saying as a result of but was it reciprocated by the Hindus?
Yes. Lot of support from Hindus and Christians. So
maybe that explains the amnesia, right? Maybe they thought the best way to cope with this whole horrible moment is to forget this that this happened and let's move on as if it hasn't happened. I want to come back to the present a little bit, and you have been basically all over the place. You know, I follow you on Facebook, and I see you giving talks all over in Hyderabad. In fact, I think you and I spoke at La Makan just a
yes.
apart, right?
Totally missed you. That
yeah. So I missed your talk, and So Farhan is a very good friend of mine, and he was saying that, oh, you missed Afzal's talk. So how is your book being received by people in India, especially in Hyderabad, and you also spoke in Delhi, right? So are people looking at this and are they trying to draw lessons going forward? Because there's a lot of polarization taking place right now in India with the Waqf Board, for example, the Waqf Board Amendment Bill and others. So how are people reacting to this storytelling from you?
That's actually, I'm so, in many ways, I'm so delighted to see that because even though my previous book was also about ordinary Muslims and the Hindus. It's like ran into several editions, and then also last year, 2 years back, there was South Asian edition, very less expensive South Asian edition as well. It is still taught in like so many universities, but it's like it still is confined to academic community.
Yeah.
So, but this book, Muqtedar Bhai, this is outside the community, our academic community. I would say I got more response from like these different communities of Hyderabad. Like, of course, back home, like in Hyderabad, actually, people, even though it's an expensive
Yeah.
book, they bought the books in the groups, like 60 to 100 groups, and then they read the book and then invited me to talk about the book. So this is, and then when I was there, of course, there were academicians, literary people. More than that, I saw ordinary people, particularly this 20 plus generation from the community, both Hindus and Muslims. So they actually wanted to understand
What happened?
what happened immediately after independence in the Deccan. And then there is also rise of awareness like about Deccan identity. And then because of this new politics of nationalism, Hindu nationalism, and then Hindutva. So they actually, there is a lot of interest in reading history, understanding the events, and then like implications of those histories, and then how mainstream histories marginalize these histories. They wanted to see that. They were discussing all these things, and then at that moment, the book came.
So the timing was very good.
Perfect timing.
So, but what is the impact that it is having? Is it just solving their curiosity, or is it having some kind of an impact in their own identity? Because these are also new people, right? New Muslims
Yeah.
and new Hindus you're talking about.
Right.
Who are so curious about history. My
Right.
generation was not. Like, I never, growing up in India, felt the need to go and find out something about
Right.
police action, because I heard about the police action, and from occasionally people would bring it up in some context or the other, but that curiosity was not there to say, okay, let me go to a library. There was no internet in those days to figure it out, right?
No.
Is it also because there is, I mean, this whole project of Hindu nationalism is also
That
right,
is exactly the
driving force?
1998, Advani visited Hyderabad and gave a talk. It was the 50th year of police action.
Okay.
He used the term Hyderabad liberation. And then he also encouraged the people to celebrate this as Hyderabad liberation, not like violence or anything. So it's, of course, from Advani's speech, I actually documented some of the contents from the speech. I was also one of the witnesses of this speech.
Oh, you did hear him? Okay.
Yes, I was there. And then that was actually like, but of course, I never kind of thought of writing this book, but that movement actually made both Hindus and Muslims, particularly this new generation, 20 plus age group, Hindus and Muslims, to go back to that history. Actually, Advani was the one who initiated this debate, quite interestingly. So there was this tension between, oh, this is on the one hand, you have these stories about violence, and then you have Telangana armed struggle. And on the other hand, this Advani says, okay, we got to celebrate this. So how you are going to, the immediate question for both Muslims and Hindus at that point was like, how you are going to celebrate a massacre, right? So that question actually is a political question for many of them. So there was a political debate first.
But if you look at the creation of Pakistan, for example, it also went
Right,
along with a huge massacre, right?
right, right.
It's like saying, how can Pakistan celebrate
Yeah, right, right. Yeah,
independence or whatever they do on the 14th of August as a celebration
right,
because
right,
it
right.
came along with it. But
Yeah.
there is this trend now in Indian academia where they simply accuse all academic historians as Marxist uh, and leftist, and the perception is that these are fake histories, and the real
Right,
histories are now going to be written by non-historians
right, right,
who are not trained to be historians, who are
right,
going to make movies
right,
and fictionalize the past. Uh,
right.
no, how is that? I mean, that can't be a positive and helpful thing, right? That you discard every history project that has been done in the last 60, 70 years
Right, right.
um, and try to project the idea that India was always the Hindu state for the
Right,
last 5,000 years.
right,
And
right.
so, in spite of that, you're saying that there is a curiosity to know.
Yeah, yeah, there is a lot of curiosity. It's a political curiosity. So people became more political rather than like not, they're not religious anymore. They're
Or
not like, they're not thinking like as Hindus or Muslims or anything. But of course, at the same time, we need to accept that there was the influence of Hindu nationalism, and then there was like Hindu groups, political groups like Bharatiya Janata Party, ABVP, Akhila Bharatiya Vidyarthi Parishad, and all these like organizations that were also producing and circulating the vocabulary of Hindu nationalism, right?
Mhm.
But what I saw, like beginning 1992, of course, it was 1992, the demolition of Babri Mosque was there, and then 1998, and then there was Gujarat riots in like 2004 or something like that, and then later we have the rise of Modi Hindutva. So all these phases, rather than like people talking about religious aspects, they started talking about political dimensions. So in ordinary vocabulary, this kind of politics, they became like what I would certainly say is a popular idea. Like everyone like talking about this, and then they are trying to learn how to deal with this new vocabulary, new political situation, and then how to face Hindutva, and then what could we take from history, and then what could we take from religion, and then how much we can learn from Sufism or like South Indian Bhakti movement to counter this. So there are like so many things that became part of this discourse. So this is like not an academic discourse, not a scholarly debate. This is all coming from ordinary people, right? So that way, I think that kind of
It's like an
people,
awakening. It's like an
yeah,
awakening.
awakening awareness about identities and then sense of belonging. And then there was also like people like were like sympathetic or empathetic to Muslim question. So they just want to talk about like, okay, these people are being marginalized. These people are being treated as like anti-nationalists, and then sometimes they are called as jihadists. So they kind of that kind of vocabulary created huge awareness, and this is all political.
The Razakar film flopped, isn't it? In a big way.
Totally, like
Yeah.
we can imagine that, right? People are not ready to accept that kind of like demonization, that kind of anti-Muslim sentiment.
So we've been talking a lot about your book, but I want my audience to also know that you are a very celebrated, national award-winning poet in the Telugu language. And believe it or not, as preparation to this show, I listened to one of your interviews in Telugu, and I must say the first 2-3 minutes or 4 minutes, I could not understand anything. But then after 4-5 minutes, it was like I could understand everything. The Telugu
Yeah.
came back to me. So let's hear a poem from you of your choice in Telugu, and then please translate it for our audience.
Thank you so much. There is nothing because this reading poetry is like the most like happy thing for me. Like happy thing for me. Like so, but in recent times, I wrote more about Hyderabadi identity. So, okay, so I kind of these conversations during my field research made me aware of so many complicated issues of identity and sense of belonging. And then I was trying to look at Hyderabad, the city itself, from a this lens of my field research. And then I wrote a poem about Charminar. I will read Telugu first, and then I also have English translation. The title is చార్మినార్ సూర్యుడికెదురుగా ఒక సీతాకోక చిలక ఆత్మహత్యకి ముందు విడిచి వెళ్ళిన కోకల రంగులు రోడ్డు మీద మెరుస్తూ కనిపిస్తాయి. 1000 మందికి పైనే ఈ రోడ్డుని తొక్కి వెళ్ళిపోయారు, ఎవరికెవరూ కనిపించకుండా. మధ్యాహ్నం చార్మినార్ సిగ మీద సూర్యుడు తెల్లబంతి పువ్వై నవ్వుతున్నప్పుడు కాసేపు అతని ఒకానొక చూపులోకి నువ్వు ప్రయాణించు. సీతాకొక చిలుక తన రంగులన్నీ మరిచిపోయి నలుపులోకి నిష్క్రమించింది ఈ మలుపు దగ్గరే. ఇక్కడి నుంచి జీవితాన్ని చూడు, అదెలా కనిపిస్తుందో కాస్త చెప్పు. ఇప్పటిదాకా నడుస్తూనో పరిగెత్తుతూనో వెళ్ళిన ఆ 1000 మంది కనీసం 1000 అబద్ధాలు చెప్పారు కదా అమాయకంగానే. దట్ ఇస్ ద తెలుగు. And then now I read English. Across from the Charminar. This is a recurring image from in my recent poetry. Across from the Charminar, you see how one butterfly left us a trace of its color before killing itself on this busy street. Here, 1,000 people, one then the other, crossed and walked on without even looking. Any afternoon, when the sun smiles like a white flower on the head of the Charminar, just walk straight into his look. It is not so hard to pour one look into an ever-burning oven, a house of molten sides. Here where the butterfly forgot its color and flew off into the dark, stay and stare straight into life, tell me how it looks. The 1,000 people who walked, limped, and ran by this road told me at least 1,000 lies, but in innocent tongues.
Oh, wow. It's very, very interesting. It also speaks to your book in some ways. Yeah. So thank you very much, Afsar, for this wonderful rendition of your Telugu and English poem. And once again, congratulations on your book.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you for writing. For our listeners, thank you for watching. I will post a link to Professor Afsar's book on Amazon in the description of this video and to his other books. So please, for those of you who are interested in the subject, definitely get a copy of it. It's also very well written. I did not want to read some of the direct quotations and stories that he has. They have to be read from the book. So please definitely read it. And thank you everybody for watching. And those of you who have not subscribed to Khanversations, please subscribe to Khanversations, like this video, press the bell icon. Don't forget to share it with others. And Afsar, thank you very much once again.
Thank you so much. Bye.